All right. Welcome, anybody who's joining me. Today, we're going to read the second chapter of the Swiss Family Robinson. Yesterday, we read the first chapter, and we learned that the Robinson family from Switzerland, that's why they're called the Swiss Family Robinson, they have been, their big ship that they were on got into a bad storm. They wrecked at sea, and the other people that were on the boat with them abandoned ship in the lifeboats, and the lifeboats were broken up against shore. They are assumed to not have survived. So the Robinson family, it consists of the mother, the father, and four boys, ranging in age, I think, from 7 to 16, I think, if I'm remembering properly. And they have a lot of supplies on the big ship that crashed, and they're bringing over as many supplies as they can. Slowly but surely, they built a raft to get to shore. They're on this island. So far on the island, they have met monkeys. They have met jackals that attacked their large dogs that they have with them. And they assume there are what they call savages. Now, remember, this was written in 1812, so you'll hear them use words that we probably would not use any longer. But this is written in 1812 language, so they call them savages. That they have seen evidence of, but they've not met them. So today we're going to start chapter 2. By the way, today I'm live streaming from the Teachers Lounge in the 800 building, if you're wondering where I am. It's going to be a little quieter today. I don't think I'll be interrupted by any of my dogs while at school. So anyway, chapter 2 is called Adventures and Discoveries, and I'll stop and show you the pictures as I get to them. How to occupy ourselves most usefully during this third day on the island was a subject of grave discussion while we partook of breakfast. The boys were anxious for another day's march in search of a suitable place for encampment, while my wife and I thought it better to repair the wreck and bring it with us from wherever we considered would add comfort. So it was decided that Fritz and I should set about in our tub to the wreck. And other boys begged eagerly to be allowed to go, but I told them that in order to bring them plenty of good things, I must have room on the raft for them. Seeing the truth of what I said, they relinquished their desire, and each thought of some article that they wished for us to remember. Our biscuits are so hard and dry, father, said Ernest, that they are almost unedible. If you could bring us a little butter, it would greatly improve them. He need not do that, interrupted Jack, for there is a whole cask of something, which I'm sure from the smell is butter, close at hand. I found it on the beach yesterday, but as it was too heavy for me, I hid it and forgot all about it. Come now, and I'll show you where it is. Ernest and he set off and reappeared a few minutes later, carrying between them a large cask, from which a fatty substance was oozing. After having satisfied ourselves that Jack's nose had not deceived him, we cut a small hole and extracted as much butter as we needed for our present use. Then we toasted some biscuits, buttered them hot, and found what a delicious addition it had been made to our store of luxuries. While we were thus employed, the dogs entered, and we saw that they had received some deep and painful cuts from last night's contest. Having washed a piece of butter in fresh water and thus extracted the salt, my wife anointed their wounds, which evidently afforded them great relief. Hi, David. If the poor animals had had spiked collars, they would have served as weapons in their defense, and they could not have been so badly wounded, said Jack. If Mama will help me, I will undertake to make some for them today. Here's a picture of the dogs. They're large dogs, but they don't say what kind of dogs. Maybe Great Danes, I don't know. With all my heart, answered his mother, I but can't see where the materials are to come from. Leave that to Jack, I said. He knows what he's about. The tugboat was soon ready, and having taken leave of those who were to remain behind, Fritz and I embarked. Before leaving, we had set up a pole, to which we fastened a long strip of canvas. This was to serve as a signal to us. In case of danger, my wife was to pull it down, fire a gun 3 times, while we agreed that we should remain all night on the vessel to burn lights to show that all was well. When we got a little ways from the shore, I noticed that a strong current was running in the direction in which we were to be going, by which we were carried a considerable way without much exertion on our part. On our appearance on board, the lowing of the cows and the bleating of the sheep testified to their satisfaction at seeing us again, and the fresh provender and water with which we took care to supply them immediately were consumed with great avidity. Their immediate wants ministered to, we began to consider what was the most important thing to be done. I think, said Fritz, that we'd better first look out for the sail for our boat. The current, which aided us so much in coming, will be against us in returning, as the boat will be heavily laden. We will partly be taken up with steering. That would be almost impossible for me to row against it. His suggestion appeared to me so sensible that I agreed to it at once. I sought out the broken yard, which was large enough to serve as our mast, and also a weaker piece to which to fix our sail, and Fritz nailed a thick plank across one of the tubs and made a hole in it to which we might stick the mast. Then I cut a large triangular piece from a roll of canvas, which I found in the hold. I fastened it to the mast as well as I could. Two ropes which were attached, one to the yard and the other to the extremity of the boat, enabled us to direct the sail at pleasure, while to finish with, Fritz mounted a small flag which he watched floating on the breeze with delight. By the time our work was completed, the evening was so far advanced that we decided to remain where we were till the morrow. So, hoisting a signal as prearranged, we made those on shore aware of our intention. The remainder of the day was spent in ransacking the vessel and replacing the stones that we had thrown into our boat for ballast by articles we were likely to prove infinite value to us during our exile. Anticipating a lengthened sojourn in this uninhabited country, I sought out those things which would help us sustain life and enable us to protect ourselves from the attacks of enemies. First of all, we provided ourselves with a large quantity of powder and lead, knowing that without these, our means of sustenance would be scant. I also made myself the possessor of a varied assortment of kettles, pots, basins, knives, forks, and other domestic utensils, with which the ship was well stocked. Amongst the captain's private property, we found several bottles of wine and brandy, which, along with a few Westphalian hams and certain sacks of wheat and maize, I transferred them to the boat. At the request of Fritz, I added to our already heavy cargo some hammocks and blankets, which he thought would add greatly to our comfort. Also some cord, some sailcloth, and a keg of sulfur with which to renew our supply of matches. By the time we got all these stowed away, our tubs were loaded to the edge. Night fell suddenly, and as I did not consider it safe to remain on the wreck, we made our preparations for passing hours of darkness in a tugboat, which was securely anchored close to the vessel. As soon as the day broke, I set to work to make arrangements for conveying the cattle to land. This seemed at first somewhat perplexing. Fritz suggested that we should make a raft for them, and I pointed out the difficulty of getting it to land, even if the animals could be got to remain quietly on them, which I very much doubted. At last it occurred to me that a sort of floating apparatus might be attached to each animal, and as the idea was quickly seized by Fritz, who longed for the fun of seeing them in the water, I resolved to try the experiment. Selecting a sheep, I attached floats to its side, and having placed a cord around its neck, I threw it into the water. At first it disappeared, but soon it struggled to the surface and, supported by the belt, swam excellently. Satisfied of the practicability of the plan, we set to work vigorously. I proceeded to provide all of our livestock with this novel swimming suit. A quality of cork which we discovered on board served to keep the smaller animals afloat. But on each side of the cow and ass was necessary to fasten an empty cask by leather bands over their backs. To complete the arrangement, a strong cord was knotted round the neck of each of them, and with these we intended to tow them after us when we got on board the boat. This done, we made a breach in the side of the vessel and lowered them into the water. At first they seemed greatly frightened and plunged so violently that I feared they would break loose from us, but soon they resigned themselves to the necessities of the case and floated along gallantly. Fritz and I now embarked and sailed toward land, congratulating ourselves meanwhile on the manufacture of the sail, which was serving its purpose admirably. On our return, my wife drew my attention to the belt of yellow skin which Jack wore, and into which he had thrust two old pistols. "Why, Jack, you look exactly like a brigand," I said. "Where did you pick up that wonderful adornment?" "I made it myself," he answered with apparent satisfaction. "I also made a couple of collars for the dogs, with which will enable them to defend themselves." Calling Topsy and Bill, he showed me the bands, bristling with long nails that he had fastened to them. "Very cleverly done, my boy," I said approvingly. Here's the picture of the dogs. And their collars with big nails sticking out of them. "But where did you get the... Surely you did not make that too." "Fritz's jackal furnished me with it," he replied, "and Mamma sewed the ends together." Commending his ingenuity, I betook myself to the tent, where my wife had gone to prepare supper. But thinking our store of victuals must be very low, I sent Fritz for one of the hams that we brought with us in the wreck. The children were delighted with the sight of this, which they called civilized food, and which, together with some turtles' eggs that Jack had found in the sand by the seashore, afforded us a delicious repast. While we were enjoying the good things before us, I asked my wife how she had passed the time during my absence. I had many strange adventures and daring deeds to recount, she answered, laughing. When you left, I resolved to set off and explore the island in hopes that before you return, I might have discovered some suitable spot which we could remove our tent. The boys who entered joyfully into my plan provided themselves with arms and provisions, and bearing a can of water and an axe, and accompanied by the dogs, I set out on my march. As the sun was beating down upon us most unmercifully, we hurried our steps toward the little wood on our right. But here, owing to the long grass and weeds which tripped us continually, our progress was exceedingly slow and laborious. For a good while we advanced without seeing anything worthy of notice, but suddenly we were startled by a large whirring noise quite close to us. And at the same moment, a huge bird rose almost at our feet and flew swiftly skyward. The boys were so taken by surprise they did not attempt to take aim. How unfortunate, moaned Ernest as it disappeared. A moment more and I should have brought it down. We must be more watchful again, remarked Jack. And now, as the bird is lost to us, the best thing we can do is to look for its nest, which must be close at hand. After searching carefully among the grass and reeds, Ernest found the nest, but the contents did not repay him for his trouble. They consisted only of a few broken eggshells, which led us to conclude that the young ones had left but a short time before. Then we entered a small little grove of trees. The height I had never seen equaled. Among their branches fluttered immense number of birds of varied and beautiful plumage, who treated us to a concert of the most delightful music. Ernest found entertaining employment in trying to classify them, but the prodigious height of the trees on which they were perched rendered his effort almost useless. The form and width of the girth of these trees astonished us greatly. Their immense trunks, instead of growing out from the ground, were supported by powerful roots, which formed a series of supporting arches immediately under the trunk, and thence ran out in all directions, disappearing into the soil only here and there. Here's a picture of it. We could build a grand house in one of the trees which Mother has just described, cried Ernest eagerly. Why, Ernest, I said, I don't want to become altogether a fowl in the air, I hope. I think it's wiser to keep on terra firma as long as possible. What would your mother say to such a mad freak? I was just about to suggest it, she answered, when Ernest interrupted me. I think the plan is a capital one, and I expect when you see the place that you'll agree with me. Such was my wife's account of the events of the day, and when it was finished, we all retired for the night. The next morning, I felt greatly refreshed by the sound sleep that I had enjoyed, and while my wife was preparing breakfast, I brought up from the shore of various articles which she had found there the day before. Having stored them in a corner of the tent, I sat down with my family to our morning meal. Now for me, which along with some sailor's biscuit was to form our repast. Yes, I replied, I considered your project very seriously, but to my mind it has several disadvantages. In the first place, here we are close to the wreck, where there will still be many things which, if we could obtain them, would be invaluable to us in our exiled state, which if we could remove farther inland, we must give up all hope of recovering. Besides, this spot is well suited to our defenseless condition. We are shut in between sea and rocks, and it is with difficulty that any enemy can approach us. For these reasons, I think it would be foolish to leave it hastily. Now, what have you to urge in favor of your plan? I think I can produce as many objections to your remaining here as you can to be removed, she replied smilingly, and I expect to have little trouble in bringing you to my way of thinking. Our present habitation may be secure enough, but still our adventure with the jackals proves that it is not unassailable. They managed to find us out, and it is not possible for more cunning and dangerous animals may do the same. In our home in the tree, we should feel perfectly secure from the encroachments of such terrible visitors. As regards to the treasure still on board the wreck, I would renounce them willingly rather than suffer the anxiety that your absence causes me. Further, here on this sandy desert, we are exposed during the whole day to the scorching rays of the sun, which the tent is powerless to ward off. I very much fear for the health of the children may suffer in consequence. Think of how different it would be if we lived in the shelter of a cool grove where the heat could hardly penetrate, where delicious fruits are hanging on all sides, inviting us to refresh ourselves. Very well argued, I said. You have almost, if not quite, convinced me. I shall go to the wood now, and if the tree be as suitable for habitation as your description leads me to think it is, we shall lose no time in transporting our possessions thither. Setting out, I reached without adventure to the much talked about plantation, and was in no wise disappointment in the beauty of the spot. The size of the trees surpassed anything I could have imagined, and seemed admirably adapted for our purpose. I immediately decided to put my wife's plan into execution, and on reaching home, congratulated her heartily for her selection of such a charming spot for our future abode. The boys wished to start on the moment, and it was with difficulty that I could get them to listen to me while I explained the different arrangements with which to be made before we could transport our belongings to the other side of the river. My wife thought the cow and ass could carry them. I told her how necessary it was that our provisions and ammunition should be conveyed without the risk of wetting. She once agreed with me that our best plan was to construct a bridge, with which we would enable us to easily get all in safety to the other side. In order to carry out this plan, however, a lot of timber must be procured. For this, it was necessary to take another voyage to the wreck. We soon got ready our tugboat, and I, accompanied this time by Ernest and Fritz, set out on our second journey by sea. Again, wind and tide were in our favor, and we floated swiftly along. As we were passing close to a small island that lay out in the bay, Ernest, who was amusing himself with a telescope, suddenly cried, "Look, Papa, did you ever see such a flock of birds?" And a cloud of sea moths, albatrosses, and other members of the feathered tribe rose and wheeled in their flight in ever returning circles, and settled against the shore, all the time uttering most ear-piercing cries. "There must be some cause for such an assemblage," I said. "We had better approach and see what has attracted them in such numbers." We had not advanced much nearer before we could distinguish a dark object which lay half covered by the water, and on which a countless host of birds was feasting ravenously. "It's the carcass of one of the sea monsters, of which we have often read, which are sure to abound here," said Ernest, who dearly liked giving his opinion on all subjects, and who, this time, was not mistaken. It was the dead body of a huge shark on which the birds were perched. "What a gigantic brute," said Fritz, as he regarded it wonderingly. "From what I've read on sharks, I had no idea of their size. Why, our donkey would only be able to be a bite with such a monster as this." Here are the birds feasting on the dead shark. "It's the largest I've ever seen," I replied. Wishing to examine the carcass minutely, Ernest frightened away some birds which were still hovering around it. We then cut off some portions of the rough skin, which it occurred to me might be useful in various ways, especially as a substitute for a file. These Jack nailed to a piece of plank to dry, and we returned to the boat. When about to put out to sea again to go to the wreck, I noticed a large number of planks and beams that the tide had cast upon the shore of the island. These I saw with extreme pleasure, for they were well adapted for the purpose I had in view, and would save us the trouble of taking a longer journey. Having selected a good many of the most suitable and bound them together into a sort of a raft, we then secured it to the stern of the boat. We hoisted our sail and turned our faces homeward. We soon arrived at our landing place and were received with a joyful shout by Jack and Franz, who, along with their mother, were wandering by the bank of the river, were greatly astonished at our speedy return. Jack had fish nets slung over his shoulder, and little Franz dangled a carefully tied handkerchief, whose contents seemed to afford him great satisfaction. "What treasure have you got there, my son?" I asked, seeing that he expected me to be interested in his possessions. "Ever so many crabs, Papa," he answered gleefully, "and I caught them every one myself." Here he opened his handkerchief and displayed a good number of crawfish, which he had found sticking to the remains of one of the jackals that had assailed us, that we had thrown into the river. Jack's net also contained many of these small shellfish. They were very young. I begged the boys to replace them in the water in order that they might grow larger and serve us as an article of food. They obediently did, though I saw that Franz relinquished with a very evident regret. In order to divert his attention from what he looked on as a great loss, I asked him if he could point out to me any place which had struck his fancy as a site for the bridge. But before he had time to answer, Ernest called, I know a splendid place quite near here. If you come, I'll show it to you, and you'll sure be to choose it. I followed him to the spot that met with his approval and found it was indeed very suitable, the only objection to it being that it was considerable distance from the nearest point where we could land the timber. This difficulty was overcome, however, by imagining our cow as a reindeer and adopting the custom of the Laplanders. Taking a strong rope, I fastened it to a piece of timber, then tied the other end to the horns of the animal, which I drove forward. Thus, by degrees, our wood was removed to the chosen spot. Now, I said, when everything was ready to commence operations, we must measure the width of the stream, as we may not have any longs long enough to reach across. That'll be easy enough, said Fritz. It'll only be necessary to tie a stone to the end of a cord, throw it across, then we can draw it close to the edge of the water on the other side, and the length of the twine will give us the measure we seek. Having put this ingenious yet simple plan into practice, we found that the river was about 18 feet wide. As it required the principal beams to have a resting place on each bank of the stream, we selected 3, each of which was about 24 feet in length. But how to lay these enormous pieces of wood across was a startling difficulty, which we discussed for a long time without hitting on any way of solving it. At last, a means of accomplishing our desire struck me. Taking a strong rope, I tied the end of the beams, to the branch of a tree that overshadowed us. Then I found a longer rope to the other edge of the beam. Walking boldly through the river, I carried it to the opposite shore, where I threw it over another branch. Coming back, I attached the other end of the second rope to the cow and the ass and drove them rapidly from the shore. My plan succeeded admirably. The log rose slowly in the air and swung to the other side of the river amid the shouts of the boys, its own weight keeping it firm. The task which we now had to accomplish was comparatively easy. 2 with the other similar logs were laid parallel with the first, and a series of short stakes were nailed across them. Thus we constructed a bridge, which was between 8 and 9 feet in width. By the time this was completed, the night again closed in around us, and we returned to our tent. There's a picture of them building their. Since the night of our attack by the jackals, I was continually in fear of the encroachment of some new enemy, and I spent many sleepless hours in expectation of a warning bark from the dogs, on whose watchfulness I fully depended. This night especially, sleep refused to visit my eyelids. I tossed restlessly in my mossy bed, longing for the dawn. Suddenly, my ear caught a sound outside the tent, and while listening for it to be repeated, I heard the low whine from one of the dogs. This was succeeded by a loud bark, so I sprang quickly, fearing it was some cause for alarm. Advancing to the tent door, I opened it cautiously and peered out into the night. The moon was now hidden behind a heavy bank of clouds, and I could distinguish nothing but Topsy and Bill, who rounded me with every appearance of terror. Expecting the approach of some enemy, I re-entered the tent and awoke my family. There is a danger of some sort close at hand, I said. We must be prepared to meet it. Rise quickly and get ready our firearms. Keep close to me and take good care not to go a foot from our dwelling. It may be savages from some neighboring island who have come to try their arrows on the whiteskins. But whatever it be, man or beast, let us be ready to receive it. While the boys were making their hurried preparations, the dogs continually barked loudly, and even the monkey, as if it scented danger in the air, became restless and burrowed deeper into its nest of hay, as if in search for greater security. When all were ready, I opened the door carefully. Scarcely had I done so when the dogs rushed past me and cowered trembling in the corner of the tent. Whatever the danger might be was evidently close at hand, so I called my boys to remain near me while I withdrew into the outside. The moon, which until now had been almost completely hidden, emerged at this moment from behind its veil of clouds and shone brightly, displaying the horrible, grinning faces and glittering lances of about a dozen savages who stood within a few yards of us. Seeing that they were discovered, they raised a wild yell and rushed toward the tent, but not before they were prepared for their attack. Now, boys, I called to the boys who stood behind me. Here they come. Better to frighten them than hurt them if we can, so aim above their heads. Fire! Our reception of them was even more effective than I expected. For a moment, they stood paralyzed, as if the earth had opened in front of them. Then, uttering a demonic shriek of disappointment and terror, they turned and fled with wonderful rapidity toward the sea. They plunged into the water and struck out boldly for a small island that lay in the middle of the bay. We waited, hoping to see them arrive at their destination, but the light of the moon was not strong enough yet to admit of this. So, firing another volley as farewell, which this time they received in silence, we hurried toward the tent. At daybreak, got up and set about our preparations for removing as quickly as possible to the promised land, as the children had named that part of the island where we intended to take up our abode. Okay, that is the end of chapter 2. So they met the other inhabitants of the island and scared them off. Luckily, they just fired above their heads, but that was enough to scare the natives and send them into the ocean. So they're moving from their tent near the beach, on the beach, to building a tree house in these gigantic trees in the safety and the cool climate inner island. So I think tomorrow, hopefully, we will read chapter 3, which is called The House in the Tree. So we'll learn more about the tree house that they're going to build. As we are reading this, if you have any questions, if you don't understand a part, if you have a comment about the book, leave it in the comment section and I will answer those questions after I'm done reading each chapter. So until we meet again, I love you guys and I'll see you later. Bye.